Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Weich. I'm the Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I am very proud to welcome you to another in our series of University of Baltimore School of Law webinars, called it Law in Focus. And this afternoon's webinar is very special because we are celebrating Constitution Day. Tomorrow, as everyone knows, September 17th, is the anniversary of our venerable Constitution. And every university that receives public funding is required, actually, to have programming about the Constitution. And we're very proud to have that obligation, very pleased to take up that mantle. And of course, we're going to be talking about the First Amendment today, because the topic of this afternoon's webinar is misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. Now, I'm very pleased and honored to be able to introduce our moderator, Dean Dwayne Wickham from Morgan State University. Dean Wickham is a distinguished professor and the founding dean of the School of Global Journalism and Communication at Morgan State. He is a native Baltimorean, and he spent 42 years as a working journalist for outlets such as the Baltimore Sun, U.S. News and World Report, CBS News, and USA Today, where he wrote a nationally syndicated opinion column for 30 years. Prior to coming to Morgan State University, he served as interim chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at North Carolina A&T State University. And he also served as a distinguished professor of journalism at Delaware State University and elsewhere. Dean Wickham is the author of 3 books: Woodhome, A Black Man's Story of Growing Up Alone, Bill Clinton and Black America, and Fire at Will. He's a founding member and former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, and he received that organization's Lifetime Achievement Award and is a member of its Hall of Fame. So please welcome Dean Wickham, and I turn the Zoom microphone over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ron. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me back to my alma mater. It's always a pleasure to return home, even if only virtually. I'm happy to be the moderator of this event today. It is something that is a conversation piece of great interest to journalists, as I continue to be: misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. To get us through this discussion, we've assembled an impressive panel of experts. But before we get underway, I'd like to tell you about the next webinar in this series that will occur on Wednesday, September the 30th. It's titled Civil Disobedience, Democracy, and Structural Racism: What's Federalism Got to Do with It? A panel of UB law professors will look at the authority of federal and state governments over the kinds of protests and marches and demonstrations we've been seeing around the country in response to racial injustice and excessive force that's been used against Blacks by some law enforcement officers. You can learn more about this upcoming webinar and register for it by following the link on the homepage of the University of Baltimore Law website. Now let me get into this introduction of our panelists. First, Eric Easton is a professor emeritus at UB Law School, where until 2018, he was a professor who taught communications law, media law, and constitutional law, among other courses. Before joining the UB Law faculty in 1993, he was a professional journalist for more than 20 years. He earned his JD at the University of Maryland in Baltimore and his PhD in journalism from the University of Maryland at College Park. Last year, he spent 2 weeks in Kosovo teaching digital media, fake news. Well, he wasn't really teaching fake news, but he was talking about fake news in his instruction and media literacy as a Fulbright specialist. Our next panelist is Jasmine Mcnealy. She is an associate professor in the Department of Telecommunication in the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where she is also associate director of the Marion Brechner, First Amendment Project. Additionally, she is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. In her research, she studies media technology and law with an emphasis on privacy, surveillance, and data governance. Professor McNealy holds a PhD in mass communications with an emphasis in media law and a JD from the University of Florida and a Bachelor of Science degree in journalism and Afro-American studies from the University of Wisconsin. Sandra Beninsky, our final panelist, is the Abel Professor in Baltimore Journalism for the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland in College Park. She's a graduate of Boston University. Beninsky received a law degree from the University of Baltimore in 1993. Before joining the Merrill faculty in 2008, Beninsky had an impressive career at the Baltimore Sun, where she worked her way up from reporter to deputy managing editor. Her leadership of the paper's coverage of the Washington Beltway snipers' mass murders made the Sun a finalist for the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting. But maybe even more impressive, the HBO series, The Wire, if you watched it, yeah, you probably were addicted to it like me, named a character who portrayed a Baltimore journalist after Beninsky, because the producer said she was a legend in the Baltimore Sun newsroom. So there you have it, three outstanding panelists for a very timely and provocative discussion of our topic, misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. We want this to be an interactive conversation. Your thoughts and questions are very important to us. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function of Zoom. You can see it on the page there. To pose your questions, send them to us, and we will get in as many as we can. Eric, let me begin with you by asking what I call the why question. Why are we talking so much about misinformation, disinformation, and fake news these days? Haven't they all been a part of the political life of this country from its earliest days?
They have indeed, Dean. They've been a part of our political culture since the Revolutionary War period and all throughout our history. But to answer the why question today, I think there are two things taking place at the same time, two phenomena that are quite unprecedented, I think, in our history. One is that we're reaching three critical decision points where information is absolutely vital. Of course, we all know about the election coming up in November. That's one. We're all suffering through the pandemic and trying to figure out how to live our lives. That's two. And three, we're seeing on the West Coast and the Gulf Coast the effects of climate change. All of these require extraordinary amount of good, reliable, solid information. At the same time, we have an explosive media landscape, particularly with social media, but the internet in general has really changed the media landscape to the point where there is a proliferation of information, more information than any of us can handle. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. And a lot of that information simply isn't so, for any number of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. And so I think that's the why for why we're here today talking about this.
But haven't we always found in the history of this country problems similar to this, where we had competition for that space, that public space, that news space, competition from pamphleteers, competition from partisan press, competition that left for many people to try to decipher what is news. I mean, what is the real news of the day? So is it different because the technology has changed, because the delivery systems have changed?
I think so. I think the technology that we have today differs from the pamphleteer, even the newspaper, even broadcast, in terms of its global reach. Not only that, but there's no mediator in today's technological landscape. Everyone's a publisher, everyone's a reporter, everyone's an author, and there's nothing in between that person and a global audience. Those are the differences. For sure, the phenomenon of disinformation, fake news, and so forth has been with us forever, but the delivery system has changed dramatically.
Jasmine, you're an attorney and you're working in the First Amendment Center. What does law have to do with any of this?
Well, I think law has a lot to do with it in the perspective that people want to regulate speech when they talk about what do we do about misinformation, disinformation. So I think that what people really want, not as much as regulating the speech, is to stop the harm that misinformation and disinformation campaigns can cause. So Eric talked about the impacts on elections. So both within the United States, but around the world, elections have been impacted based on misinformation and disinformation campaigns. We could look at Kenya back in 2010. We can look at several other cases around the globe before even the United States impacted in 2016. But also, not just elections, but people are dying from the impact of misinformation and disinformation. We only need to look at what happened in Myanmar and the spread of misinformation and disinformation related to Rohingya Muslim people and the massacre that has happened over there, right? And this is not just Myanmar, it's a case study again, but there are other places where similar things are happening. And so you have this type of speech that is impacting significantly people's lives, and people want something to be done about it because the impacts aren't encouraging, they're not good, it's not like a happy, fun time. This is long-term, immediate impacts on life and how we are able to live. And so I think law has a lot to do with that. So law can possibly prohibit things or punish things, or it can make things easier. And so what people want, I think, is for the conduct, the impacts to stop, and for law to do something about that.
So we want to legislate conduct as it relates to how people, how they tweet, how they put comments on Facebook, what do we want to do with legislation?
I think there's a couple of things.
You want to stop the president from tweeting? You want to pass a law to do that?
No, we don't want to stop the president from tweeting. What we wanted the president to stop doing is tweeting stuff that is wrong, right? That is untrue, that has been manipulated. Why? Because some people believe in the credibility of those things that he's tweeting because of his power, right? Because of his position, because he fits sometimes the mold of what they want to believe in. And other times there are other people, not just the president of the United States, but various people, actors both within and outside of the United States that have similar levels of power that are doing similar things. And it's not just Twitter, it's WhatsApp. It is Facebook, of course, Instagram even, right? And it's not just political things. It is things to do with health, which could be considered a political thing, but things to do with health, things to do with body image, and manipulation of body images on IG, and how that impacts particularly young people looking at those images over and over and over again, right? So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation happening, and people want the negative impacts to stop. And I think Eric mentioned earlier that, and you mentioned as well, Dean Wickham, that we've had fake news or misinformation for a long time. But if I read a story about Bat Boy in Florida, that has no impact on me whatsoever unless I go out and try to find him. But the impact of calling me and my group of people, undesirable, or the spread that we spread coronavirus, can have immediate negative impacts. So what we're looking at now are totally, while they're all misinformation, the impacts are totally different.
So Sandy, you have come in a relative sense, fresh from the battleground, from the newsroom. I like to say about people like you who come from the newsroom into the academy, that you're like soldiers who come from the front line with the smell of gunpowder fresh on their hands. Tell us about what it's like in the newsroom, and how does a newsroom deal with fake news? But more importantly, how do you deal with disinformation?
So we have reached a place in journalism where it is almost impossible to do reporting without social media. Because everyone uses it, we rely on it. We rely on it to find people who are interested in different subjects that we want to cover. We also, however, run the risk of picking up something that is complete disinformation or misinformation. And so the burden in newsrooms is to try and sort this out and present the information in a clear, concise way. And often the disinformation and misinformation on social media is so much livelier and so much more engaging. And as Dr. McNealy said, there's confirmation bias. We want to believe the stuff that we already feel. But there is great danger here for reporters to track stuff down, but also for anybody who's not in journalism. The technology has gotten so great that, you know, there are what are called deep fakes out there. We can take a video of Nancy Pelosi standing at a microphone making a statement, and in an hour it can be on social media, slowed down and then speeded up to make it appear that she's drunk. Should that be running on social media? Well, we know it's not true. And Dr. McNealy talked about health, issues of health. The problem is so bad that I'm going to read here, April 30th, the United Nations put out a tip sheet for fighting 5 ways the UN is fighting the infodemic of misinformation. And there's a quote here from the Melissa Fleming, Undersecretary General for Global Communications for the UN. Fear, uncertainty, and the proliferation of fake news have the potential to weaken the national and global response to the virus, bolster nativist narratives, and provide opportunities for those who may seek to exploit this moment to deepen social divisions. And that's how powerful this is right now. On my Twitter account this morning comes an ad for the Reface app. And I can take my face and put it on Elon Musk's body and vice versa. I can create a character who, he's not his little stick figure. He looks absolutely real. And I can market that to you by posting it on social media at any moment. And that can become very dangerous.
So I'm hearing a lot about what the problem is, not so much yet about where the solutions lie. So we have a question, and the question is Snopes the most reliable website for fact checking? Let's go there first, and then we'll talk about some solutions, potentially. Anyone else watch? I'm a reader of Snopes, just for entertainment purposes, I should say.
So I think that's a great site. Yeah. But there's so many out there. There's the Washington Post has a fact checker. The Poynter Institute has a fact checker. Google fact check, and you'll come across great resources that help you understand things. Sometimes they're not flatly false, but they're shaded and turned in a way that make them not completely true, and that's important as well.
So Eric, this is an old school question for you, largely because I'm old school, not you.
I'm plenty old school too.
I'm just wondering, as we talk about news, I say to people oftentimes when I pick up a newspaper or watch, I still read newspapers, and I watch news on television, that there's too much repeating and not enough reporting. Is that a part of the problem? Does that contribute to this fake news and misinformation? I mean, that we're just reporting what other people assume, at least somebody else down the line we're repeating what they've reported.
Well, Sandy talked about social media as a kind of indispensable tool, albeit flawed, for reporting today. Of course, my reporting days were 25, 30, 30. We didn't on it. Still, we did rely on what people told us. All sources, in effect, constitute some kind of repeating. So I think that problem has been with us for a long time. I'm not sure it's new, but I will say that if you watch CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, you'll see a lot of material that was originally came out on social media. And sometimes it's fact-checked well and sometimes not. There was a story in today's Washington Post how the Post itself was fooled by a, I guess you'd call it a dirty trick, a kind of disinformation from a conservative operative to fool the newspaper into thinking that an FBI raid took place that didn't take place. So they corrected it within 2 hours. Nevertheless,
isn't the fault there that they're repeating and not reporting?
they themselves admitted that they simply didn't do the fact checking they needed to do before they published. Yeah. That's a lesson for all of us, I think. That we just have to keep telling ourselves over and over again as journalists, you've got to check the facts.
So I've got, again, I want to repeat, I have 3 lawyers in front of me. New York Times versus Sullivan, Section 230 of the Communications Act. We like people to journalists and media to have the ability to report without being held accountable for some misinformation. Don't we?
Yes, we do. And we want the public to make the decision about what goes and what doesn't, right? We don't want the government beginning to decide what language is acceptable, what messages are acceptable. However, that leaves many people vulnerable on social media to hate attacks, to ruined reputations. So Section 230, arguably the internet wouldn't be what it is today, right? Without Section 230, if the government hadn't said, you internet providers back, help me out, 25 years ago, Section 230?
1996.
1996, okay, 24. Would the internet, would social media be as robust as they are today? On the other hand, is there a way under the First Amendment to amend 230 so that it does not have these gaping holes that people who want to do harmful things can drive through?
So what's the legal fix? Is anybody talking about the fix for this in terms of legislation?
Well, I think so. We don't want Congress to continue making bad law as a general matter, right? They're really good at making bad law. But I think with respect to Section 230, when it started out, it was a modest claim, a very modest claim. It was like, okay, we see you're small, right? So they weren't, AOL wasn't a behemoth back then. Amazon was maybe a twinkle in somebody's eye. Facebook didn't exist. Google was not on anybody's radar. It didn't exist, quite frankly. People weren't even in grad school by that time. So these were modest claims to help these burgeoning commercial internet sites who were attempting to keep control with respect to their discussion boards. A very modest claim, so they could say, look, we were trying to do something please don't hurt us. Please don't put us out of business. What it has been interpreted as is something totally different and wide, broadly applied in places that it was never meant to apply. And so perhaps then Congress needs to reevaluate the language it is using with respect to the CDA. And I don't mean in a FOSTA-SESTA kind of way either, because those aren't that great. They're actually pretty bad. But what I mean is they need to narrow that language back to its original intent. Hey, when you're attempting to keep control, we like it and we'll help you out. Not when you discriminate, not when you use, when you allow all kinds of language, not when you participate in the libelous, whatever behavior. Another point is, I would also like to add that in Sullivan, which we use as this blanket, like, yes, we want robust debate on issues of public concern. It's important to note that in that opinion, the court says that falsity creeps in, like it was an accident, not that falsity is aggressively inserted into the conversation. So we were talking about public officials and transferred then to issues of public concern. It's that some people may make a mistake, not we want to promote this really false narrative. In fact, we're going to create things that are totally false to fool people. Totally different matters, right? Even though we're interpreting these cases, which are our blockbuster, our bedrock cases that we use to protect the First Amendment, but we're talking about completely different things than what could even be imagined by the court.
So Sandy, would you agree then that if tested, New York versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court decision, does not give total cover to a challenge to Section 230?
Does it? No, it doesn't. I don't think it does, right? No, because Section 230, I think, applies in a different category. Of course, if we're talking libel, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But the internet provides so much disinformation and misinformation is so easily, I shouldn't blame the internet. So much misinformation and disinformation moves with the speed of sound on the internet that that's where 230, I think, fits, that that the internet providers, the same way a man who owns a bookstore can't be held liable for something in a book that is defamatory, right? So by the same token, that seemed to apply to the internet. As Dr. McNealy said, when the internet was this big, the internet now is, as big as the universe. So if Section 230 were amended to say something like, which Professor Daniel Citron at Boston University Law School, she has language to insert there that says you have protection if you have taken something like made all reasonable efforts to make sure that this is being handled responsibly. So the burden then is put on the private companies, the social media companies, right? Which is why the Mark Zuckerbergs get hauled before Congress in an effort to say, you need to clean this up or Congress is coming to clean it up. And
so here's a question. Should we be concerned about paid screeners at Facebook, Twitter, etc., deciding what information may be disseminated on those sites? There are no screeners if I stand on a soapbox on a Baltimore street corner to express my views.
So, Eric, do you want to go with that one?
Well, I could address that. I think having paid screeners determine what posts should be allowed on social media sites, as long as it's held within the private sector, The First Amendment is not offended by it. Those screeners might be thought of as comparable to copy editors on a newspaper desk. They are not controlled by government. They're not regulated by government. And I don't think the First Amendment is offended by having that force out there. Where the problem lies is when the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world were saying, and he was, although not now, but he was saying, we're just a neutral platform. We have nothing to do with the problem. We're just going to let all the information out there and take no responsibility for it. He's changed his tune. And I think by the amendment of Section 230, which, as Sandy said, is simply an immunization from legal liability for social media and other web-based platforms for whatever third parties, that is the general population, might post there. The First Amendment does not compel that kind of immunity. It doesn't provide that kind of immunity from newspapers or broadcasters or magazines, and removing it or modifying it, as Danielle Citron has proposed, to require some reasonable steps to take responsibility, I think is also also doesn't offend the First Amendment.
We've got another question. Thinking about Bob Woodward's new book, what obligation did he have to make the information he had regarding the severity of the virus available to the public long before the publication of his book? By holding on to that information, doesn't he expose journalism to unnecessary criticism? What's the job of the journalist? So if you take it out of the context of the question and you ask if a journalist is out covering a crime scene or covering an event, and a photographer or reporter, and they see a crime unfold, is it their job, quite aside from the moral question, is it their job to stop what they're doing and to intervene? Do they have a responsibility when they get information that suggests behavior that has serious consequences? This behavior, if you follow the argument, resulted in lives being lost. Did Bob Woodward have a responsibility to step in at that moment and tell the world what was going on?
It's a hotly debated subject right now, and you read all kinds of opinions about it, and Woodward has addressed it himself. Of course, his position is that he didn't know if what the president was saying was true or not. And there's a certain amount of reasonableness to that position. But I think the law teaches us mostly that journalists are citizens first, and whatever obligations we have as citizens, we also have as journalists. And if we see a crime in progress and don't call the police, I would say that's a lapse in civic duty. And the First Amendment doesn't immunize reporters from having civic responsibilities. Likewise, I think Bob Woodward, if not in February or March, perhaps by May, he could have come out with that material. And the fact that it doesn't come out until September, I think borders on some irresponsibility. And I say that with the greatest respect for Bob Woodward.
That was Bob's, what, 20th book?
Yeah.
He's written a lot of books about politics in Washington. One would say he's made a lot of money. I'm wondering whether for anyone, if it passes the laugh test, that he said he couldn't tell whether the president was telling the truth or not.
There is an argument that I think it was Woodward himself who made, and this, we debated this in class last week. If he had published that in March, and I agree with Eric, at the beginning of March, we didn't know where this was going. One might argue by April or May, we knew where it was going. Would he have had the rest of the information from the president? So this is this balance here, right? The president shuts off communication. Would we have had the rest of that information? And I understand he was writing a book that was going to make him money. I do understand that. But there is a lot of interesting information that he got after that. Now, people continue to die all summer, which is the counterweight.
Yeah. And there's a bit of voyeurism there. I mean, if we say that, well, we got more information, so is that the benefit, that we receive more information? How can we act on that information? We can't, can we? So, well.
Journalistic activity. So I don't know if the conversation is important to be having, but this is more of a morals and values question versus like, what do we want the Constitution and the legislators or policymakers to be thinking about with respect to this question of what a journalist must do?
But
yeah, I agree with Jasmine entirely on that. I would never want the law to tell Bob Woodward when he has to publish what he learns. I think Dean's question had to do with an ethical responsibility, moral responsibility, and I think that's where the area gets rather gray. I'm 100% agree with Jasmine that the law has no business telling journalists what and when to publish.
isn't there the risk, at least, that if we forego some of our moral responsibilities in these areas, that we invite legislation?
I'm not sure if the courts, I'm not sure what kind of legislation you're envisioning.
Well, if you are just a person walking down the street and you observe a crime, don't you have a legal obligation to at least to report that crime or to participate in the investigation?
I'd say you have a moral one. There's no law that says you have to or you can be prosecuted. So, and as Eric said, and Dr. McNealy said, it's the same, journalists are people, and a lot of laws point out that journalists don't have any extra rights beyond that of any citizen. So a moral and ethical issue, but not a legal one.
A legal obligation to the extent that if you are called to give testimony as to what you saw, whether you're a journalist or a citizen or another kind of citizen, you do have that legal obligation to testify as to what you actually witnessed. And this doesn't even, if you saw the crime being committed, you have an obligation to testify to it. It has nothing to do with a reporter's privilege or any kind of testimonial privilege that reporters have for confidential sources.
We have another question here. The president today retweeted a video of Joe Biden giving a speech that was doctored to make it look like Biden was playing an anti-police song on his smartphone when he actually wasn't. And so the writer's question is, my question is, a lot of news stories end up editorializing a bit, using certain verbiage to explain something that skews the point of view of the story. I guess the question is, isn't that a kind of misinformation, disinformation to the reader, thinking they're reading the facts versus an opinion piece?
So I'm not sure specifically what story or stories the questioner might be asking, but I think there's no question that this is a very difficult administration to cover for some of the issues that were just raised. reporters are not stenographers. So if an elected official stands up and says things that aren't true, we hope that what the reader or the broadcast viewer is going to see is not going to be just this recitation that lets the falsehoods stand. That then requires journalists to try and offer context. That isn't exactly true. That bill was actually passed in the last administration. The vaccines won't be available till next year, whatever it is. And I do think that makes it very difficult sometimes for the reporter to present that in a way that it does not sound to be editorializing. That said, I think some readers then do step in and say, that appears to be editorializing if you are pointing out the discrepancies in the official's speech. I'm talking rather carefully here, I know. So if anybody else wants to jump in, please do.
Let me try and maybe talk a little more boldly, and that is, I think journalism reached a certain turning point not too long ago when we started talking about lies, and we talked about the administration lying. That does go a step beyond. I think a step beyond saying that the facts are otherwise, and how it goes beyond is that there's an element of intent to a lie. There's an element of purpose, and I think anytime a journalist calls something a lie, they are making an explicit statement that as to motivation, as to intent. And if they know that, then I think the lie is acceptable. I mean, the use of the term lie is acceptable. But if they don't, then I agree with the questioner. It definitely crosses a line into editorializing if you use that word and you don't have a good understanding and knowledge of the motivation behind what was said.
Well, here's another question that piggybacks onto your answer and the previous question. What is the best way to go about the fact checking? Because it seems that if an untruth is not immediately challenged, it gains some level of traction, particularly when well publicized. At times, I watch news conferences with leaders who stand at podiums and openly lie. And while reporters may write an article later addressing these lies, I want to hear reporters challenge the speaker right there in the room and call them out for the lie in real time. Yet this then feeds narratives of the press being out to get certain leaders and other potential pitfalls. Not to, that's where it stops. I'm just going to add this editorial comment, and that is kind of gets back to, I think, what Eric was saying. How does this writer know that it's a lie? The assumption is that we really have some consciousness of thought about this, that we hear something, and if Trump says it, for instance, and we've categorized all these statements as lies, misstatements, misinformation, and so are we more likely to suspect that he's lying and then expect journalists to call him out? Are there people who stand before cameras today, politicians, who does not face that same challenge, and should they?
I think there's no question that this is, as I said, a very difficult administration to cover for these reasons. Reporters who stand up, for example, at press conferences at the White House and challenge the president are hailed by some as heroes and scorned by others as disrespectful editorializers. I think this administration is very shrewd in the way it deals with information. So here's a quick little example from the weekend. when you talk about how do we know if it's a lie, how do we know if it's not true, the speaker asked, how do we fact check in real time? Part of it is on us. So the burden is on the news consumer. We have to be more skeptical than we ever were. I was trying to think back today. My parents were great newspaper readers. They read 3 a day. I don't remember them putting down the paper and saying, that woman's lying again. Maybe they were thinking, this person's always out to get the mayor. But today, I think the burden is much greater on us. So we have to be skeptical. If it feels too good to be true, it often is. Here's a little example from Sunday morning. The president tweeted out a beautiful photograph of a lawn in Ohio that just had lined up scores of Trump signs, scores, the whole lawn covered with Trump signs. And said like, wow, MAGA, thank you, Ohio. And Alec McGillis, who lives a couple of miles from the law school, immediately tweeted, hey, I took that picture in 2016 in Ohio. It's not a new picture. So essentially we were crowdsourcing there. That's just not true. That didn't happen. We crowdsourced an incident in Baltimore just this week where somebody tweeted, my daughter was accosted by Black Lives Matter protesters. No, she wasn't. Her boyfriend got out of the car because squeegee kids came to the car. A completely different, because people started asking the police, and the police had no such record of a Black Lives Matter protest anywhere nearby. So the burden is on us. And reporters, I think, are trying really hard. And it is sometimes hard in the moment to, as you say, Dean Wickham, to try and figure out what was he thinking just now. Did he misspeak? Did he misrepresent? Was it a flat out lie? Very difficult to do in the moment.
Can I follow that?
Please, go ahead.
And so, what Professor Baninsky is talking about is really important. And since we're at a law school, I don't think it's wrong for me to use, like, do we want journalists to really be trying to find the mens rea for people speaking? What I think needs to happen is a true power analysis added to here, right? So remember also with mens rea, with intent, remember recklessness also gets you just as high as punishment as an actual intent to commit a crime. So being reckless, if you are in such a position of power where your words carry so much weight that whatever you say, whether it's an accidental mistruth or miscommunication, that it has a significant impact, then you should be held accountable for that reckless distribution, so to speak, of false information. So you didn't know at this time that it was wrong, but you know what? You should have. If you're going to be talking about it, if you're in a position of power to talk about it, if you're in a position, such a position that what you say is material to how people make decisions about their lives and quite frankly, the lives of other people, then guess what? You need to be a bit more careful. And someone needs to hold you accountable. And, since regular folks, we don't have always the time, the resources, the money to hold politicians accountable right in the moment, like journalists can, then journalists can act as the people saying, well, hold on a second. Actually, this is the case, or this is not the case, right? So I think it is important to have a true consideration of the entirety of the issue. Is not just about like, should we call them saying that they're lying, but you know what, recklessness matters because what they're saying has impact beyond just it being words, but they have power. They're in positions of power. They're public officials, or at least they're in positions that have great influence, and that matters too.
So for at least the first century of our country, politicians, presidential candidates campaign from home. I mean, they sat on their porches and they had surrogates go out, and there was no way to immediately transmit their words to others far beyond the porch or the back of a train from which they were speaking. But today, if a politician says something, the president or the Speaker of the House or the Senate Minority Leader or the Democratic candidate for president says something, his words are projected across this nation in just rapid fire order. And so if they're not challenged at that moment, the possibility that their words will be caught up by the challenge is probably fairly slim. The possibility that their words will get out to millions of people without challenge is pretty big. And don't we as journalists have a responsibility? And isn't this what the protections that we've been afforded by Sullivan and 230 give us? The protections that allow us to do our reporting without fear that somehow, if we make a mistake in the process, we will be tied and courted and punished. So shouldn't we take advantage of that opportunity? If the law gives us that protection.
There's no question that the ability of misinformation and disinformation to spread throughout society faster than the correction can keep up with it is absolutely true. It's always been said that lies travel faster than truth, but it's even more true today because of the amplification of social media and because the algorithms on which those social media are based, in fact, encourage the more rapid and broader dissemination of provocative material rather than simple truth. And we're and journalists. I haven't been a journalist in many years, but I still use the term we. Journalists, we're struggling to keep up with it. It's a nearly impossible task, and frankly, I think what Sandy said about a lot of that responsibility has to be on the reader or the listener. And the best we can do is try and educate them broadly as to media literacy and so forth.
Here's a question responding to or reacting to something that Sandy said. Sandy alluded to unscrupulous actors taking advantage of gaping holes in law to use disinformation surrounding coronavirus to fuel instability. As one of the retail grocery heroes from this past spring and summer, I have since left the industry because of the overwhelming presence of Americans who buy into the disinformation and refuse to wear masks in public, constituting a biological threat that likely kills at least one citizen per day. What does anybody, including the president and supporting media outlets, who actively fuel this reckless behavior have to gain? We're asking you now to maybe go beyond the scope of journalism and even law. Well, maybe lawyers might try. You got to make a case. Then you can give us some idea of what you think they have to gain by this action, this activity, this unscrupulous behavior. Don't wear a mask. Masks are for chumps.
I think somehow this was politicized in a way that most of us never saw coming. That to not wear a mask was some kind of statement about American freedom. And I've read articles that said in 1918, there were some people who felt the same way. I hate wearing a mask. I wear it all the time. But somehow we were divided into camps, And I think social media helped with that a lot. You're on one team or you're on the other team. And one team isn't wearing masks because they think it has to do with the First Amendment or the Constitution. I think the media has done a great job of pointing out how important masks are. However, somehow that message didn't penetrate all the way. And it may be that some of us are so narrow in our media choices, and we watch only one network or we read only certain things on social media that confirms our biases, that we then refuse to consider the science. And that's also a kind of misinformation and or disinformation.
We've got about 4.5 minutes left, about 4 minutes left in this webinar. I wonder if you want to round this discussion out for me, give me some sense of where we are. We start off talking about disinformation, misinformation, and fake news, and we wanted to juxtapose it in some way with law. And how can we get out of this? Is there a legal way to get out of this problem? Is there a legal fix that we can turn to, that we can suggest to the Congress or to look for in existing law to help us get out of this fix? Or are we just doomed to ride this wave?
I don't think we're doomed to ride this wave forever. We're doomed to ride it for a while, and I wouldn't expect this Congress to be able to do anything. But I think a hard look at the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, is in order. Ironically, that's something that the president has called for, although he comes at it from a very different position. But nevertheless, I think the circumstances of today are so different than they were in 1996 with the internet, that a hard look at 230, whether it's useful, whether it should be amended, there are all kinds of proposals out there to do that. I think that would be a big help. I think it's a place to begin that doesn't begin with government regulation. An outright repeal of Section 230 would still not mean any kind of government regulation. It simply means that private citizens can enforce their rights through private lawsuits. So I think that's the place to begin from a legal standpoint.
So I think it's important to recognize, one, I agree with Eric, and two, that what we're dealing with is a socio-technical issue. Emphasis on the socio, right? The social part, the human part. Like the real question is, what is our problem? And what then can law do about the human condition? Well, there are certain things that law can take care of with respect to the conditions and the environment surrounding fake news, misinformation, disinformation campaigns. One, thinking about all of the social ills that plague us, right? That would make people more likely to choose to believe certain things about certain people or certain ideas, those kinds of things. We can have better education. We can have, different kind of healthcare system. We can have a whole lot of other things that Congress can take care of. We don't necessarily want them monkeying around with our constitutional rights. We just don't. And on the more technical side, we can think about how tech amplifies these social issues, right? But it's very complex, and it won't be a simple single congressional act that fixes what foundationally has to do with us as people.
Sandy, last word. Would you like the last word, Sandy?
I agree completely with Dr. McNealy. I think inviting the government in to decide what works and what doesn't work on social media is really dangerous. So then we are relying on the businesses who run these social platforms to begin to work on it. But the issue is so much bigger. This issue is social ills that show up and are magnified through social media.
Well, these are questions that are difficult to answer, and it's a conversation that I'm sure will go on for many, many months, hopefully not years to come. I want to wrap this up, but before I thank my guests, let me remind our viewers that we have another webinar coming up on Wednesday, September the 30th, Civil Disobedience, Democracy, and Structural Racism, What's Federalism Got to Do with It? You can find more information about the webinar on the University of Baltimore Law website. Please check it out, and hopefully we'll see you with us on September the 30th. To my guests, my panel, who helped me, who kept me afloat and got me through this, Easton, Sandy Beninsky, and Jasmine McNealy, thank you so much. I appreciate all that you've given us today. You've been a great panel, and we've gotten a lot of information out of you, although we still haven't figured out what law has got to do with this panel, but we'll get it. We'll work it out sooner or later. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you again somewhere, sometime soon.